Jaslene Carter knew the professor hated her the moment she walked in, but she never expected what he'd do next. In front of 200 students, he handed her a problem designed to make her fail, and laughed before she touched the chalk. But when she began solving it faster than he could breathe, the room turned silent. Because halfway through the equation, Jaslene uncovered something she wasn't supposed to see, and the secret hidden inside that problem could destroy the entire university. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The rain was soft but relentless, the morning Jaslene Carter stepped through the towering iron-wrought gates of Oxford University. It wasn't the kind of rain that made headlines, just enough to blur the stone paths and hush the world into gray silence. Jaslene's boots, freshly polished, clipped against the ancient cobblestones, sounding like defiance with every step. Her full scholarship acceptance letter, folded neatly in her coat pocket, felt heavier than it should. She paused just before entering the quad, her breath visible in the crisp English air. This was Oxford, its spires and ivory buildings, soaked in centuries of legacy, none of which included girls like her. Not Southern, not black, not from a forgotten Alabama zip code, where public schools barely had working heaters, let alone AP classes. But she was here, and they were going to see her. Inside the main hall of Pembroke College, everything smelled of varnished wood and quiet judgment. Students filled the narrow corridor, heads bowed over books or muttering in accents laced with old money and entitlement. Jaslene's entrance barely caused a ripple until she spoke. "Excuse me, is this the direction to Lecture Hall B?" she asked a nearby student, her southern accent sliding out unfiltered. The boy, a pale redhead in a blazer with elbow patches, blinked. "It's that way," he said slowly, like giving directions to a child. He didn't point. He didn't smile. Jaslene nodded politely, even though his eyes said everything. "What are you doing here?" That look followed her like shadow. Not loud, not overt, but constant. The air itself felt coated in caution. Smiles too polite, compliments too sharp around the edges. Every time she raised her hand in orientation, she caught the pause, the flicker in the professor's eye, like they weren't expecting someone like her to participate, let alone be right. By her second day, it was clear the game wasn't just about grades. It was about belonging, and they were making the rules up as they went, just to make sure she stayed just outside the circle. Still, Jaslene didn't shrink. She took notes with discipline, arrived early, asked questions that made even her British peers raise brows. Her mother hadn't raised her to fade, and Miss Carolyn, her high school calculus teacher, had spent every Sunday tutoring her until she could solve integrals in her sleep. But even steel bends when struck the right way. That blow came in the form of Professor Reginald Hawkes. He was legend at Oxford. Published at 26, tenured by 33. He'd lectured at MIT, advised global financial firms, and wore his accolades like tailored armor. Tall, stern, and terrifyingly articulate, he commanded the auditorium like a courtroom judge. Students adored him, feared him, and gossiped about how he once made a Rhodes Scholar cry in mid-class. Jaslene had read his books before arriving. His work on nonlinear systems was groundbreaking. She'd even quoted him in her scholarship essay. But none of that mattered when she took her seat in his lecture hall. He glanced at her once, one brief surgical look during roll call, and skipped her name. She thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. For the next few lectures, Professor Hawkes never once called on her, even when her hand was the only one raised. He asked for answers. She had them, and he ignored her like she was part of the wallpaper. Other students noticed. A few offered her sheepish smiles. One girl, Emily, from Chicago, whispered, "I think he's weird about Americans." But Jaslene wasn't stupid. She saw how he responded to the two white boys from Boston. They joked with him after class. He laughed. Still, she showed up, every day. Pen sharp, mind sharper. On a Wednesday morning, just 2 weeks into term, the tide shifted, and not in the way she expected. The lecture hall buzzed with quiet energy as Professor Hawkes scribbled equations across the board with chalk so fast it sounded like scratching. Today's topic, advanced differential equations. Then, without turning around, he paused mid-equation and said, "Miss Carter." Jaslene blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. His voice cut sharper this time. "Miss Carter, would you be so kind as to approach the board?" Heads turned. Whispered murmurs followed. Jaslene stood slowly, her heart drumming against her ribs. This was the first time he'd ever addressed her directly. She reached the front, eyes locked on the massive equation sprawled before her. Except something felt off. The symbols weren't just complex, they were misaligned. Parts of it felt more like a trap than a task. Professor Hawks capped his marker, stepped aside, and gestured to the problem. "This," he said coolly, "is a graduate-level problem that I'd like you to solve for the class. Take your time. We'll be watching." There was no malice in his tone, just a detached formality that made it worse. Jaslene picked up the marker, her fingers slightly damp. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of ventilation. Phones began rising, students filming. The tension wasn't academic anymore. It was performative. Spectacle. As she stared at the board, her mind raced. He didn't expect her to solve it. That was the point. But he didn't know Jaslene Carter. She had spent her childhood solving problems harder than this, like figuring out how to study when the lights got cut off, or how to navigate life with a father in prison. This was just math. She inhaled through her nose, slow and steady, and her fingers tightened around the marker. And then something clicked. Her eyes scanned the equation again. She saw it. It wasn't just a hard problem, it was rigged. Not mathematically wrong, but layered in a way meant to trip someone unfamiliar with Hawks's obscure methods. A pedagogical sleight of hand disguised as academic rigor. Jaslene turned her head slightly, looking at the class behind her. Some eyes were wide with anticipation, others were smug. Then she looked at Hawks. He was smiling. That small, closed-lipped smirk of a man who thought he'd already won. Her lips parted slightly, and she began to write. Not hurried, not panicked. Each line she wrote was calm, methodical, surgical. But she wasn't solving it straight through. She was unraveling it, calling out the steps Hawks had embedded to confuse, then countering them in real time. The marker glided across the board. One term flipped, another got factored. Subtle corrections surfaced like ghosts in the math. And just as she reached the halfway point, she stopped mid-sentence. Not because she couldn't go on, but because she didn't have to. Jaslene turned slowly, her expression unreadable, and looked directly at Hawks. "I just realized," she said, her voice calm. Southern drawl untouched. "This problem has your signature shortcut embedded in line 3. It's from your 2012 paper, the one you said no undergrad could spot. Interesting choice." The room froze. Professor Hawks said nothing, but his smile was gone. And in that stunned silence, every student realized he hadn't assigned her that problem to test her. He'd assigned it to humiliate her. The chalkboard loomed like a verdict waiting to be written. Jaslene Carter stood still for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, her hand inches from the board, her fingertips tingling as if they sensed what was coming before her mind could process it. The room behind her was unnervingly silent. 200 students, all watching, all waiting for the spectacle to begin. Professor Reginald Hawks had returned to his podium, his hand resting neatly on a leather-bound lecture binder. His face was unreadable to most, but to Jaslene, the micro-expressions, the faint flicker of satisfaction at the corners of his mouth were louder than applause. This wasn't pedagogy, this was theater, and she had been cast as the fool. The equation he had written was a towering structure of nested functions, implicit derivatives, and theoretical variables, known mostly to those knee-deep in doctoral dissertations. It wasn't just challenging, it was targeted. It was the kind of question not even her brightest peers had seen, and the few who had were likely cramming for qualifying exams, not first-year lectures. The chalk in her hand felt heavier than it should. Around her, soft snickers floated through the air, masked behind coughs and shuffled notebooks. No one openly mocked her. Not yet. But the tension hummed with expectation. One student in the back whispered to another. "He really gave that to her." A smirk. A muffled laugh. Jaslene could feel every eye pressing into her back. But she didn't turn around. Not yet. She examined the equation again, and suddenly, her breath caught. The setup was familiar, but warped. She recognized elements from a publication Hawks had released years ago. He'd tucked a misleading assumption into the middle. Something that, if overlooked, would lead to a mathematically sound but logically wrong conclusion. The kind of trick that required intimate familiarity with his personal academic style to catch. Her mind flashed back to Alabama, to her mother's worn couch where she first read Hawks' papers from a PDF downloaded at the local library. Back then, she thought he was a genius. Now she saw something else, A man willing to use brilliance as a weapon. She stepped forward. Her hand rose, deliberate and steady, and she began to write. First, she untangled the outermost layer of the equation. Clean, direct, like slicing through brush to reveal a hidden path. The sound of chalk on slate was hypnotic, rhythmic. Every stroke pulled a string tighter around the room. Students leaned forward, unsure how to react, and then she spoke. Her voice, quiet but precise, drifted through the silence. The function here implies continuity, but the constraint embedded 2 lines down introduces a contradiction. We can't treat both as simultaneously true without acknowledging the paradox. A rustle of notebooks. Several students blinked. One boy slowly lowered his phone, realizing he wasn't watching a breakdown. He was watching something else entirely. She moved down the board, each line of reasoning delivered with surgical clarity. Her tone was not performative, not defensive. It was instructional. She wasn't surviving this moment. She was owning it. At the back of the room, Professor Hawk's smile had vanished. He crossed one arm over the other, shifting slightly in his stance. The students weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. And what they saw wasn't a girl under pressure. They saw a mind dismantling complexity with elegance. She's actually doing it. Someone whispered, too stunned to pretend otherwise. Row by row, the math unfolded. Jaslene annotated her work, not for the professor but for the students. She explained the logic, corrected the trap, exposed the misleading variable that could derail someone trained by the textbook, but not the author. Every time she wrote something, Hawks became less relevant. The room was no longer his, and then she paused. Halfway through the problem, right before resolving the most convoluted part, she stopped writing. Her shoulders squared slightly, and she turned not to the class but to Hawks. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't need to. This trick, she said softly, relies on an unpublished assumption you first introduced in your 2012 lecture series. It's not in any of the course material. Most people wouldn't catch it unless they've read your peer-reviewed rebuttal from 20. Gasps rippled quietly across the room. I guess I read it more closely than you thought. The statement wasn't arrogance. It was revelation. Hawks blinked. Slowly. His mouth opened, then closed again, as though he wanted to protest, but found nothing to stand on. An unexpected twist of silence fell thicker, heavier than any noise. Not one student looked at their laptop. No one moved. Time seemed to freeze as Jaslene stood beside the unfinished problem. A visual contradiction to every assumption Hawks had engineered. She could have finished the problem. But she didn't. Instead, she capped the chalk and placed it back on the tray. Her meaning was clear. The point wasn't solving the problem. The point was solving him. The equation on the board would remain incomplete, but the real answer had already been delivered. As Jaslene returned to her seat, no one clapped. No one dared. But the silence wasn't emptiness. It was recognition. Hawks turned back to the board, clearing his throat. But his words came slower now. Less sharp. He tried to pivot, offering a comment about the value of multiple approaches to problem solving. But even he could hear the hollowness in it. Class dismissed 20 minutes later, but no one remembered the lecture topic. They remembered her. Jaslene exited the room quietly, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her steps, once careful, now carried something different, an unspoken power that didn't need to declare itself. But what she didn't know was that 3 phones had captured the entire exchange, high-quality, front-row footage, uploaded almost immediately to student group chats. By the time she returned to her dorm, the video had already jumped across time zones. She refreshed her notifications. Her name was trending. Comments poured in. She destroyed him. Who is she? That professor got schooled. Harvard girl levels of brilliance. Why didn't he call on her before this? At first, Jaslene didn't react. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the ceiling, unsure whether to feel victorious or exposed. But the momentum had already begun. And in another corner of the university, in a private faculty lounge, Reginald Hawks sat alone at his desk, watching the clip again and again. Each time, his expression changed, first from irritation to disbelief, then to something more dangerous. Strategy. Because men like him didn't lose. They rewrote the narrative. And Jaslene, unknowingly, had just given him a reason to sharpen his next move. Just as she closes her laptop, an email arrives from the university registrar. Subject: academic performance review. Immediate action required. For a moment, no one breathed. The chalk trembled slightly in Jaslene's hand, not from fear but from a silent tension building inside her that demanded precision. Every fiber of her being understood what this moment meant. She wasn't just working out a solution, she was speaking into centuries of assumptions, myths, and invisible ceilings, each line of math an act of quiet rebellion. She drew the first line with clarity, defining the function's root structure and isolating the constant. Her motion was fluid, as though she'd rehearsed it, but this wasn't rehearsal, it was recognition. The equation Hawks had scribbled across the board was a composite of graduate-level convolution techniques, stacked with intentional redundancies meant to distract. Jaslene began cutting through them. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Her writing moved with confident rhythm, each new variable dissected, interpreted, and neatly positioned with notation. So clean it resembled print. Every few seconds, she turned her head slightly toward the class, not for approval, but to draw them in. She spoke not to impress, but to illuminate. What he's done here, she began calmly, is use a known function g, x nested in a way that cancels itself, if you don't consider the boundary condition implied by the differential step. A soft gasp traveled through the second row. One girl's pencil paused mid-scribble. The confidence in Jaslene's voice cut through the room like light into a darkened hall. And for the first time since she'd stepped foot in this place, the walls of Oxford, the ones made of more than stone, seemed to shift. Back at the front of the class, Hawksig's expression had curdled into forced neutrality. He stood with one hand resting on the lectern, the other gripping the edge tighter than necessary. His posture said control, but his eyes flicked with restrained disbelief. This wasn't going according to plan. Jaslene pressed forward. Each component of the problem was addressed like a separate language, and she translated fluently. Where others might see a tangle of symbols, she saw the shape beneath the surface, the architectural skeleton of the equation. Her explanations unfolded like a masterclass, grounding abstract theory into digestible insight. A student in the front row who had been recording with his phone slowly lowered it, caught between awe and discomfort. He hadn't expected a performance. He expected failure, but now he was watching something he couldn't explain. Something elegant. Jaslene reached the nested integral, and instead of diving in, she paused. The reason this misleads, she said, pointing with the chalk, is because the limits here pretend to create a convergence, but they actually reference an outdated theorem. Hawks published and later quietly corrected. Most people wouldn't know that correction ever existed. The air cracked. Not literally, but something in the atmosphere changed. Jaslene hadn't just exposed a flaw in the equation. She'd revealed a concealed fingerprint, an academic trick known only to those who had studied Hawks's work closely. Heads turned to the professor, almost instinctively. Hawks didn't flinch, but his silence deepened. His reputation had been built on precision, on intellect, on crafting problems only he could untangle. But now his own design had been unraveled, by a first-year student, and worse, by one he had publicly underestimated. One student leaned toward another, and whispered, "She just referenced his own correction. That's insane." And it was. Jaslene wasn't just solving a problem. She was demonstrating mastery over the logic that built it. Her voice never rose above a classroom tone, but the implications behind her words were thunderous. The classroom, once echoing with amusement at her expense, had turned reverent. The chalkboard was now half filled with her precise scrawl, each mark an act of reclamation. For a moment, Jaslene felt something deeper than pride. She felt grounded, almost untouched by the noise behind her. In a space built to erase girls like her, she had spoken a language older than bias, and it was listening. But the silence in the room wasn't just respect. It was discomfort, because what Jaslene had done didn't fit the story. She wasn't supposed to shine. She was supposed to stumble. A moment like this, so clear, so undeniable, didn't make everyone proud. It made some people nervous. And as she continued writing, a quiet realization began to form in her chest. Her victory, however elegant, was not going to be welcomed. It would be watched, it would be dissected, and it would be used against her. Eventually, still, she continued. Jaslene reached a turning point in the equation, the midpoint where the core transformation was meant to reveal the path to a solution. She'd cut through the misdirection, but something in the structure remained off. Then she saw it. An intentional twist buried in the transformation function. A classic Hawks move. It wasn't just challenging, it was deceptive. The trick function violated its own domain constraints, which meant that any real solution would collapse if someone followed the path blindly. It wasn't a test. It was bait. She turned away from the board, chalk still in hand, and let her gaze rise. She found Hawks immediately. Their eyes locked, and in that split second, something unspoken passed between them. She knew, and now, he knew she knew. She didn't have to say it. The entire room already felt it. Still, she spoke anyway. This part here, she said, pointing to the function, relies on a limit constraint that only makes sense if you ignore the domain's behavior near zero. But since this isn't an abstract model, this was designed to mimic a real applied scenario. It collapses under scrutiny. She let the words hang in the air like smoke. A single cough echoed from the back row. A chair squeaked. And then nothing again. Professor Hawks's jaw tensed. For a moment he almost looked younger. Vulnerable. Like a man remembering the weight of consequences. But what Jaslene didn't see, what no one saw, was the email already sitting in her inbox. While she was solving math on the board, while her voice was reclaiming power, an administrator in the registrar's office had received a memo flagged urgent. The sender, Professor Reginald Hawks. The subject, concerns regarding student conduct. J. Carter. It was short, cold, and deadly. In light of today's classroom experience, I have concerns about academic integrity. Student J. Carter appears to have had access to non-public academic material. I recommend an immediate review of her admissions file and coursework. He had already begun rewriting the story. He couldn't beat her on the board. But the board wasn't the battlefield that mattered. As Jaslene stepped back from the chalkboard, letting her last sentence linger in the air, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She didn't know what storm was brewing. She didn't know how high the stakes had just risen. All she knew was that something had shifted, irreversibly. And back at the podium, Professor Hawks looked at the half-solved problem, then at the stunned faces in the room. He offered no acknowledgement. He simply said, "That will be all for today." As Jaslene gathers her things, a classmate rushes up to her and whispers, "You need to check your email right now." The final mark of chalk never touched the board. Jaslene stood before a silent sea of faces, hand hovering midair, yet something more powerful than completion filled the space between her and the equation. She had dissected every illusion Hawks had embedded, every sleight of hand that masqueraded as complexity. She hadn't just solved the problem. She had dismantled the architecture of its deception. And now, the silence was no longer filled with anticipation. It was loaded with realization. The flaw she pointed out wasn't just academic. It was pedagogical malpractice. The kind of flaw that didn't stem from oversight but intent, designed to mislead. And when a student, not even in graduate school, pulled back the curtain, it didn't just reveal the problem, it exposed the person behind it. Jaslene lowered the chalk slowly, her fingers coated in white dust that smeared against her dark skin, a quiet, poetic contrast. She placed it neatly into the tray beneath the board, and turned to face the auditorium. Eyes didn't just follow her, they clung to her. Some were wide with disbelief, others with awe, but most were unreadable, like the minds behind them were still buffering what they'd just witnessed. She scanned the room and saw no contempt in those stares now. No condescension, just raw, stunned recognition. Then she turned her head toward Professor Hawks. He hadn't moved. He stood as if someone had unplugged the world around him. His normally ironclad composure had fractured. The lines around his mouth deeper now, his posture stiffened by exposure. There was a moment, only a second, where even he seemed to be reconsidering everything he thought he knew. And Jaslene, feeling no need to drive the nail further, simply offered a nod, not of arrogance, but finality. She walked back to her seat. The footsteps echoed like gavel strikes. Every student she passed instinctively parted for her. The power dynamic had shifted so suddenly, so violently, that no one dared meet her eyes. Not even the ones who had mocked her just an hour earlier. She sat down and opened her notebook, as though nothing had happened. But everything had. Hawks finally broke the silence. "Well," he said, clearing his throat with a tight, rehearsed cough. "That was unexpected." The words fell like marbles on stone, useless, cold, and hollow. He shifted behind the podium, rifling through lecture notes that no longer held the room. No one was looking at him anymore. Even his most loyal protégés were quietly glancing between each other, trying to reconcile the professor they revered with the man who had just been intellectually undressed by a student he had tried to embarrass. No apology came. No praise either. Just a tight-lipped segue into the next portion of the lecture, which now felt as irrelevant as background music in a thunderstorm. Jaslene didn't hear most of what he said after that. The adrenaline still pumping in her veins had dulled the world around her, making it sound distant, like a room heard through a wall. But what she did notice, what struck her harder than anything, was how the energy around her had changed. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was undeniable. When the class ended, no one moved right away. It was as though the room itself had to catch up to what it had just witnessed. A few students stood slowly, dazed, their mouths partially open, as if trying to find the right words and failing. Then came the whispers. The flood. She didn't even need to finish it. She exposed the trick mid-sentence. That wasn't just solving. She taught it. Did you see Hawk's face? She caught a flaw he published. This is wild. Jaslene collected her things quietly, aware of the stares but refusing to feed them. She moved with the same grace that had carried her to Oxford, head high, shoulders back, aware of the weight she carried now. But something else lingered too, a deeper unease. Not everyone was proud of her, and some would make her pay for the discomfort she just caused. As she exited the lecture hall, a student with a camera around his neck brushed past, whispering, "That's going viral, no doubt." He didn't ask for permission. He didn't need to. Someone had already uploaded the footage before the class had even ended. Jaslene didn't check her phone. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked back across the quad beneath a sky smeared with gray clouds, the spires of Oxford rising like a stone forest above her. Her thoughts tangled between triumph and caution. Every step forward felt like stepping deeper into both spotlight and crosshairs. By the time she reached her dorm, her phone was vibrating nonstop. Missed calls, mentions, tags, group chats, emails. She opened her messages and saw the thumbnail of a video already climbing in views. It had been posted by someone anonymous. Title: Black Student Destroys Oxford Professor Live. Exposes Trick Question. Views 94 sim 212. And rising. She clicked it. The quality was surprisingly sharp. Her voice echoed through the speakers, calm and steady. Every line of math, every pause, every pivot, it was all captured. The moment she exposed the flaw, the way she turned toward Hawks, the silence afterward. Then the comments rolled in. This is what excellence looks like. She didn't just solve it, she exposed him. Hawks should retire after this. Finally, a takedown worth watching. But then, the shift. This feels staged. Why would a freshman know his private lecture notes? She must have had access to something. Too polished. Overconfident. Let's see her do it again next week. And beneath those, I smell a fraud. Quota student. Doing what quota students do. Getting help and pretending it's hers. Oxford slipping. This is embarrassing. Jaslene read each line. Slowly. One by one. Not to internalize but to understand the road ahead. She closed her laptop and sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the floor. The noise of victory was already turning into something else. Something cruel and familiar. Her phone buzzed again. An email notification appeared on screen. From Office of the Registrar. Subject: Academic Integrity Inquiry. Immediate response required. She froze. Her thumb hovered over the screen, dread crawling up her spine. She tapped it open. The email was formal. Cold. It referenced concerns raised regarding potential prior access to non-public material, citing the lecture as an incident requiring urgent review. Attached was a meeting time with the Academic Integrity Board. The sender's name was stamped at the bottom. Professor Reginald Hawks. Jaslene's breath caught. He hadn't said a word in class. He hadn't argued. He hadn't defended himself. Because he didn't need to. Not when he had the system to do it for him. He had set a trap. She had survived it. Now he was building another. And this time, he'd chosen a battlefield she couldn't control. The next morning, Jaslene wakes up to headlines across the UK. Oxford star student accused of cheating after viral lecture. The sun rose with a sharpness that betrayed the heaviness in Jaslene's chest. Her phone screen lit up before she could even pull the covers off. Notification after notification stacked on top of each other, like a digital avalanche. She blinked twice, trying to focus. Then she saw it. BBC, The Guardian, CNN, BuzzFeed, NPR. Her name, her face, the board behind her, frozen in mid-equation, hand outstretched, brows furrowed, etched into headlines across the world. Black American student outsmarts Oxford professor in viral takedown. Watch Jaslene Carter teaches her professor a lesson on live camera. Power shift in a lecture hall. First-year student shakes the old guard. By the time she reached the shared kitchen in her dorm, even the barista downstairs had heard of her. A girl in leggings dropped her coffee cup when Jaslene walked in. "Oh my God, you're her," she whispered, more awe than curiosity in her tone. Jaslene nodded slightly, unsure whether to smile or run. The oxygen around her had changed. People who once dismissed her now lingered at her door. Classmates she hadn't met suddenly wanted to study together. Messages flooded in from students across the globe. Black girls in Chicago, Cape Town, and Kingston sent messages like prayers. "You showed us what we never get to see. We watched you win in a space not built for us. You're not just brilliant, you're revolutionary." For a moment it felt like something righteous had cracked through centuries of reinforced ceilings. But Oxford was not designed for seismic shifts, and the tremors had already begun. By mid-afternoon she tried logging into her student email. The system denied access. Error 403, permission denied. At first she assumed it was a glitch, but then came the second blow. Her student portal listed no upcoming lectures. Every course removed. Every assignment vanished. The university's digital skeleton had been scrubbed of her presence. Jaslene rushed to the departmental office, each step louder than the one before, the sound of panic mounting in her head. She pushed open the wooden door, the smell of dust and academia hitting her instantly. A receptionist she'd greeted every day for weeks now barely looked up. "I need to speak with someone," Jaslene said, trying to keep her voice even. "Something's wrong with my account." The woman tapped a few keys, eyes squinting at the screen. "I see a hold on your profile," she said blandly. "You'll need to speak with your faculty advisor." "I've emailed him," Jaslene replied. "Twice." The woman offered a weak shrug. "Then I suggest waiting. These things take time." Jaslene's breath thinned. "How can there be a hold when I've done nothing wrong?" The woman finally looked up. Her face wasn't angry. It was indifferent. And somehow that was worse. "I'm sorry. I can't help further." That night, Jaslene sat on her bed, her phone pressed to her chest. She stared at the ceiling as the truth surfaced like oil on water. They were pushing her out. She had committed the one offense Oxford never forgave. She'd embarrassed power, publicly, and power, when humiliated, retaliated not through confrontation, but through quiet erasure. She checked her inbox again. Still locked out. She tried contacting Professor Ilias, the only other black faculty member in her department. No response. Even the Black Students' Union hadn't replied to her texts. Isolation closed in like a tightening grip. She wasn't paranoid. She was being methodically unseated. The next morning her story evolved again, but this time the headlines had shifted tone. "Oxford hero or academic fraud?" Viral students' lecture raises questions. Was it too perfect? Inside the allegations, did Jaslene Carter have unauthorized access to professors' work? The accusations were subtle, wrapped in the language of inquiry, not assertion, but they spread faster than fact, and the comment sections followed suit. She must have cheated. There's no way she found that flaw live. This has DI scam written all over it. Quota brain. Nothing more. Every platform that once praised her now turned her into an algorithmic liability. Media appearances she was invited to suddenly got postponed. Brands offering sponsorships ghosted her. Messages of support slowed. Even her roommate avoided eye contact. She tried to reach out to her admissions officer. Voicemail. Tried contacting the head of her college. Silence. Every door that had creaked open was slamming shut with velvet gloves. And then it got personal. A package arrived at her dorm front desk. No name, no return address, just a plain white envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Typed. Cold. Sharp. "You've embarrassed the wrong man." Jaslene sat there in the dim light of her desk lamp, heart pounding against her ribs. She turned the paper over blank. No signature, no threat, just implication. Heavy, poisonous. She clutched it for a long time before folding it twice and slipping it into her drawer. She couldn't cry. Not now. Crying was what they expected, what they wanted. Instead, she opened her laptop and typed 3 words into Google. Oxford racial scandals. The results were deeper than she imagined. Quiet cases, settled lawsuits, anonymous testimonies, students who had mysteriously withdrawn. Words like non-conducive learning environment, and academic probation hiding the real story, targeted, racialized removal. It wasn't new. It was legacy. She realized then, her fight wasn't personal. It was architectural. But this time it wasn't going to happen in the shadows. This time the light was already on. And someone was watching. Just as Jaslene closes her laptop, her phone buzzes with a new email from a faculty whistleblower. The subject line reads, "You need to see what they're hiding." The email arrived at 3:12 a.m. Jaslene hadn't been sleeping. Sleep had become a theory possible in design, impossible in execution. Her phone buzzed on the desk next to a stack of untouched textbooks, the screen glowing against the dark. Subject, "You need to see what they're hiding." No greeting, no name, just an attachment titled, "Internal Affairs Correspondence, Restricted." Her heartbeat climbed slowly, like a warning. She double-checked the sender's address. It was routed through a secure encrypted domain, not university-based, not traceable to any department she knew. But the signature on the footer, subtle, just initials, C. Hands trembling slightly, Jaslene clicked the attachment. A PDF, unfolded, page by page. Redacted memos, email threads between senior administrators, academic tribunal minutes. Each document was like a stone lifted, revealing insects crawling underneath. The tone of the files was bureaucratic, sanitized, but the substance wasn't. There, in cold, objective language, were coded indictments of students who looked like her. Quiet warnings about applicants who lacked cultural fit. Emails between deans debating how to de-escalate press attention. When a Nigerian PhD candidate reported being forced out due to questionable academic integrity. Notes flagging black students as public relations risks. And then came the name, Jaslene Carter, listed as a trigger event. Underneath it, a bulleted note, "Media optics impact. Consider containment. Leverage academic probation policy." Jaslene leaned back in her chair, nausea rising in her throat. They weren't reacting to her brilliance. They were planning her removal. She wasn't a student anymore. She was a liability. By 9 a.m. she was summoned to an official fact-finding meeting. It wasn't called a hearing. That would imply fairness. Instead, it was held in a room with frosted glass windows, led by 3 faculty members, whose affiliations were quietly known, loyalists to Hawks. Men who had built their careers attending his lectures, co-authoring his papers, citing his name like gospel in research. One woman sat at the end of the table, silent, eyes sharp, but her presence felt more like surveillance than support. They didn't accuse her outright. They didn't need to. They framed questions as hypotheticals, their tones dressed in civility. "Would you say you prepared for the lecture in any unusual way? Have you ever had access to unpublished course material? Are you aware of the academic integrity expectations outlined in the Oxford Handbook?" The trap was rhetorical. They weren't searching for truth. They were searching for gaps, anything that could be twisted into doubt. Jaslene answered calmly, knowing even her tone could be misinterpreted. "I prepared like every other student. I read. I studied. I showed up." But beneath the table, her fingers tightened into a fist. She wasn't just defending herself against suspicion. She was defending herself against a centuries-old machine. When the meeting ended, they thanked her for her cooperation and told her the process would be confidential to protect all parties. But by nightfall, another article had leaked, this time quoting an anonymous university source stating there were ongoing concerns about Carter's academic performance and compliance. The Whisper campaign had begun. Jaslene's name was being reshaped in real time, not just within Oxford, but far beyond it. She tried to fight back with transparency. She drafted a statement, had it vetted by a journalism student she trusted, and posted it publicly. "I did not cheat. I studied, I spoke, and I refused to be shamed for doing either." The post spread like wildfire. Thousands rallied to her defense, but others twisted her clarity into defiance. Too aggressive. Why is she still making this about race? This is what happens when you don't respect your elders. And that's when the stories began flooding in. Emails from Black alumni, most anonymous, detailing eerily similar experiences. A law student who had her dissertation flagged for originality, concerns after winning a moot court competition. A Rhodes Scholar candidate, who was denied faculty endorsement after one professor wrote, "We must prioritize academic fit over external narratives." A physics student whose advisor mysteriously vanished after she published a breakthrough paper on quantum thermodynamics, and was later failed for lack of participation. The patterns weren't just disturbing. They were institutional. Jaslene read each message like a mirror held up to her life. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. And that meant she had a choice to make. She could walk away quietly, keep the scholarship she still had for now, and finish her degree in silence. Or she could do what Hawks never expected: speak louder. So she contacted a reporter. Not a flashy name, not a cable network anchor. She reached out to Ava Reynolds, a black British journalist who ran an independent publication focused on higher education and racial equity. Ava had once been a student at Oxford herself, and left after creative differences with her thesis advisor mysteriously derailed her final year. They met in a coffee shop off campus, tucked between a bookstore and a florist. Jaslene brought a printout of the documents. Ava brought a recorder, a legal waiver, and fire in her eyes. The conversation lasted 4 hours. Jaslene held nothing back. When it was over, Ava promised her one thing: they've buried this kind of truth for decades. But not this time. Not with you. 3 days later, the article dropped. Silence in the Spires: How Oxford Muzzles Black Excellence. It hit like a brick through stained glass. Screenshots of internal emails, testimonies from alumni, footage from Jaslene's lecture paired with commentary from mathematicians, validating her analysis. It wasn't just a defense, it was a dismantling. The university went into panic mode. PR firms were consulted. Official statements were drafted. Terms like deep regret and commitment to inclusive excellence were floated in press releases, but they all rang hollow. Jaslene watched as the institution that tried to quietly erase her now scrambled to protect itself from public scrutiny. Some faculty started emailing her again, but not with support, with veiled warnings. Perhaps it's best to let this settle. We hope this doesn't distract from your academic journey. Things are delicate. We suggest caution moving forward. But one email, just one, stood out. It was from an internal address, a professor Jaslene had never met. The subject line was simple: "There's more, and I have it." Attached was an encrypted message and an invitation to meet. No name, just initials again. CM Jaslene opens the attached file and sees dozens of sealed case files, marked confidential, each stamped with a university crest, and one labeled Targeted Student, JC 0421. The file labeled JC 0421 blinked back at her like a curse carved into pixels. Jaslene stared at the screen, her pulse thudding in her ears. The university crest stamped on each document felt almost theatrical, regal gold overlays guarding rot. She clicked into the file, half expecting it to self-destruct, but the page loaded cleanly, methodically. It opened to a memo titled Preliminary Risk Assessment, J. Carter, dated 2 weeks before the viral lecture. It didn't reference her academic performance, it referenced her visibility. Carter displays signs of overexposure. Proactive containment may be necessary if public incidents arise. Recommend academic gatekeeping protocols to limit reputational liability. Reputational liability. She wasn't a student. She was a variable, one they had already accounted for before she'd ever picked up a piece of chalk. Jaslene scrolled further. Names surfaced. Dozens. Each file bore the same cold formatting: name, department, ethnicity, incident, outcome. But the pattern wasn't hard to spot. All the outcomes ended the same: withdrawn, expelled, academic misconduct, failure to integrate. Some files went back to the 1970s. One included a case from 1963. A Jamaican Rhodes candidate accused of plagiarism, despite no evidence, expelled within weeks of being featured in the local press. Another 1998. A black British woman studying law failed in her final term after raising concerns about her thesis advisor's racist commentary. The most recent, just 6 months before Jaslene arrived. A Nigerian student removed from the economics program after being accused of forging research citations. No tribunal, no appeal, each one buried. Each one locked in these confidential archives. Jaslene wasn't a scandal. She was the continuation of a pattern too old for most to question, and too intentional for the university to admit. But one thing became instantly clear: this wasn't just about Hawks. He was a symptom. The system was the disease. Suddenly, the file flickered. A chat window popped up at the corner of the screen. CM, we can meet. No names. Neutral ground. You need to understand the rest before you go public. Jaslene hesitated only briefly before typing back. Where? They met under the statue of a forgotten philosopher in the oldest part of campus. The figure towered above, arms outstretched as if blessing the ignorance that had festered in his name for centuries. CM arrived late, a tall white woman in her 50s, wearing a tweed coat too heavy for spring. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't sit. "You think you've uncovered the whole thing," she said, voice low, tight. "You haven't." Jaslene remained quiet. CM handed over a flash drive. "What you found was just internal assessments. PR documents. What you haven't seen are the tribunal suppressions, the blacklists, the donor correspondence." Jaslene's brow furrowed. "They have a list?" she asked, voice sharp. "A rotation of students and staff they consider image liabilities. Any black student who gains attention too fast, raises uncomfortable questions, or performs beyond what they projected, gets flagged. It's not always in writing, but the outcomes, identical." "Why are you helping me?" The woman hesitated. "Because I was once like you," she said. Different fight, same silence. She turned and walked away, coat flaring behind her. Jaslene clutched the flash drive so tightly her knuckles whitened. She returned to her room with a conviction she hadn't yet allowed herself to feel. This wasn't a story anymore. It was a reckoning. She drafted her second public statement, but this time it wouldn't be posted on her account. She contacted Ava Reynolds again. "I'm giving you the full archive," Jaslene said. "Everything. Names, dates, decisions. Not just mine. All of them." "Are you sure?" Ava's voice was low, measured. "If you do this, there's no going back." "There was never a way back," Jaslene said. "Only forward." They agreed to a coordinated release. Exposé, documents, expert commentary, survivor testimonies. A storm was coming, but Oxford moved first. 2 days before the story's scheduled release, Jaslene received a notice from the university's disciplinary committee. Subject: immediate hearing. Charges of academic misconduct and data breach. Her breath hitched. They weren't just accusing her of cheating now, they were accusing her of hacking. The letter was calculated, crafted in legalese. Violation of academic policies, breach of confidential university records, possible grounds for expulsion and visa review. That night, Jaslene couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the words containment strategy glowing like embers across her future. But then something worse. At 4:03 a.m. she received an alert from her student immigration portal. Her visa status had been flagged for irregularities. Jaslene sat upright, cold sweat breaking across her neck. She read the line again and again, subject to review, possible falsification of academic records, initiated by academic department lead. Her chest locked. There was only one person in her department with the authority to trigger that. Professor Reginald Hawkes. He hadn't just come for her reputation. He was coming for her residency. If they revoked her visa, she wouldn't just be expelled. She'd be deported, immediately, without tribunal, without trial, without goodbye. She opened her inbox again, eyes scanning frantically, praying it was a mistake. But the notification sat there like a death sentence. Her world narrowed. The walls of her dorm seemed to tilt inward. Breath, memory, future, all felt like borrowed air. She grabbed her phone, typed only one word to Ava. Now. That morning, as Jaslene's exposé drops worldwide, Oxford holds an emergency press conference, accusing her of malicious data theft and announcing formal collaboration with immigration authorities. The word deportation felt foreign on her tongue, yet it now defined every breath she took. Jaslene sat in the immigration solicitor's office, her knees locked together, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached. Outside, London buses hummed, and life moved on, untouched by the institutional claws now wrapped around her future. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Miriam Achebe, flipped through Jaslene's immigration file with attention that only came from experience. She had seen cases like this, just not like this. Not someone with international media coverage, not someone whose name was a hashtag and whose lecture takedown had become a rallying cry. The official grounds, Miriam said slowly, are allegations of data falsification in your academic background. They're claiming discrepancies between your scholarship application and your U.S. academic record. Jaslene's voice cracked. There are no discrepancies. Miriam didn't flinch. They don't need real discrepancies. They need a claim with teeth. And they've got Oxford's backing. That sentence burned. Oxford had not only severed her enrollment, they had flagged her to the Home Office. Quietly, efficiently. No public statement. No tribunal. Just a sealed complaint, sent through official academic channels. The same system that once welcomed her, now whispered her name as a threat. She was no longer a brilliant student. She was a visa case. Jaslene walked back to her dorm. Though it no longer felt like hers, her keycard access had been revoked from the main building. She had to be let in by a sympathetic junior resident, who whispered, "I'm not supposed to help you, but this is wrong." She climbed the stairs slowly. Every hallway, every wooden door, every bulletin board, now pulsed with betrayal. The college had erased her presence from the campus directory. Her advisor hadn't replied to a single message in over a week. But the walls weren't silent. People talked. She passed a group of students whispering in the library stairwell. Isn't she the one getting deported? Did she really fake her GPA? She probably plagiarized that lecture. No way she just solved it live. Jaslene kept walking, each step heavier than the last. By the time she reached her room, her inbox was filling with notices. Notice of dismissal from college housing. Effective in 10 days. Notice of immigration review. Removal date set. For failure to comply may result in legal detention. She sat on the edge of her mattress, hands shaking. It was happening. Not in the shadows. Not whispered. Publicly. Proudly. A system built on polished stone and Latin inscriptions had decided her excellence was inconvenient, and now it wanted her gone. Ava Reynolds' expose had detonated across media channels. Civil rights attorneys in both the US and UK reached out, pledging support. A coalition formed overnight. Protect Jaslene trended on social platforms. But even virality couldn't beat bureaucracy. She was still legally required to leave. The British Home Office issued a bland statement. We do not comment on individual cases, but all applicants must comply with immigration laws and academic honesty standards. Oxford released a subtler comment. We value integrity and diversity, and we are committed to fair review processes. Neither named her directly, but both had already condemned her. Miriam called again that evening. We filed an appeal, but it won't stop the clock. You're still scheduled for removal, unless we get an injunction. How likely is that? There was a pause. Too long. Unlikely, Miriam admitted, unless we prove malicious intent or institutional sabotage. Which of course they had in spades, but proving it fast enough was another matter. Jaslene packed her suitcase slowly. Each item she folded felt like failure, not because she had done anything wrong, but because this was how her journey ended, not with disgrace, but with disappearance. Then came the knock. A soft, deliberate knock on her dorm door. She opened it to find a white envelope on the ground. No one in sight. Inside, a single airline ticket. One way. London to Birmingham, Alabama. Attached was a typed note. Go quietly, before it gets worse. Her heart pounded. She hadn't told anyone her return plans. The ticket was printed under her full legal name and exact passport number. Whoever sent it had access to her immigration file. Miriam called again the next morning. Her voice was different. Sharper. We might have something. A judge in London sympathetic to civil rights cases. We're petitioning for an emergency injunction to halt your removal. Jaslene exhaled, her grip tightening on the phone. Don't unpack yet, Miriam warned. But don't board that flight either. For the next 48 hours, Jaslene was trapped in limbo. She couldn't leave. She couldn't stay. She was everywhere online, and invisible inside the institution that once photographed her for diversity brochures. On the eve of her scheduled flight, she received one last letter slipped under her door. This time, no envelope. Just a piece of torn legal stationery. Scrawled in pen, you should have solved the problem, but stayed quiet. That night she went to the airport, not to board, but to wait. The injunction was still pending. She sat by the departure gate, with her suitcase beside her, eyes scanning every face, every official, every movement. Minutes before final boarding, her phone rang. Miriam's voice cracked with relief. The judge signed it. The injunction is official. You're not going anywhere. Jaslene broke down, silent tears running down her cheeks as she closed her boarding pass and turned away from the gate. She was staying, for now, but the battle wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The next morning, she returned to her dorm to find her window shattered. A rock lay on the floor. Wrapped around it, a printed map of her childhood street in Alabama. Her family's house circled in red ink. Someone had leaked her family's address. Jaslene's mother calls. Panicked. Someone's been sitting outside their house in a car for 2 hours, engine running. The call came just after dawn, the kind of hour where bad news sounds louder. Jaslene's phone buzzed on her nightstand. She reached for it with a sleep-numbed hand, expecting another lawyer's update or media request. But the name flashing across the screen stopped her breath. "Mom," she answered quickly. "Baby," her mother whispered, voice tight with fear. "There's a car outside. Been sitting there 2 hours. Ain't moved. Ain't nobody come out." Jaslene bolted upright. Her chest tightened. "In front of the house?" she asked, barely able to steady her voice. "Parked across the street. Engine still on. Windows tinted dark. Your daddy already called the sheriff. But they say they can't do much, unless somebody gets out." Jaslene tried to breathe through the rising panic. Her mind reeled. Who had leaked their address? Why now? What message was being sent? "I'm coming home," she said quickly. "No," her mother snapped, fear turning into fierce resistance. "You stay where you are. You are fighting something bigger. Don't you dare run now." Jaslene wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her that a fight wasn't worth putting her family in danger. But deep down she knew this was part of the plan. The system didn't just isolate. It retaliated. And it never stopped at one person. Later that afternoon, a rock was thrown through their living room window. Shattered glass flew across her mother's prayer shelf. A single sheet of paper was wrapped around the rock, taped down like a statement. "Keep your genius in her place." Her father called the FBI. By evening, federal agents were parked outside their home in Montgomery. Their small brick house, the one Jaslene grew up in, now had motion sensors on the porch and a federal field report number taped to the mailbox. Jaslene sat in her off-campus flat, staring at the photo her mom sent of the shattered window. The sheet of paper unfolded on the couch. She hadn't cried during the tribunal. She hadn't cried when her name trended with slurs. But now, the tears came fast. This was no longer about equations, no longer about Oxford. This was about survival. The university responded in the most predictable way possible. Blame deflection wrapped in academic politeness. The dean of colleges released a statement. "While we regret any distress caused by recent events, we advise all students to avoid media entanglements that could escalate external hostility." Entanglements. That's what they called it now. Not racism, not harassment, not an attack on her family, an entanglement. Within 48 hours, Jaslene was informed she could no longer live in university-affiliated housing due to safety concerns. The implication was cloaked in concern, but the motive was unmistakable. She was being moved. Not to protect her, but to protect them. Ava helped her find a sublet in the city, barely furnished, cold and far from campus. A former grad student who had read her exposé offered it without rent. "You're not just fighting for yourself," he said. "You're cracking the door open for all of us." Jaslene thanked him, but her voice was hollow. She couldn't sleep, not with the thought of her parents being watched, not with the image of glass on the carpet, and the smell of fear in her mother's voice. Her inbox overflowed with death threats, each one written with the same formula: anonymous, venomous, and empty enough to evade prosecution. But it wasn't the threats that hurt most. It was the silence from her professors. The colleagues who had once praised her contributions now ghosted her name like a stain. One teaching fellow she trusted emailed her, "I want to help, but there's talk that associating with you could end careers. Even mine." She stared at that message for a long time. That's what it cost to support her. A career, a name. Everything in Oxford was traded in whispers and reputations, and she had become radioactive. The media frenzy had reached a fever pitch, but it no longer celebrated her. It dissected her. Every appearance, every gesture, every word was mined for contradiction. She didn't seem this radical when she got here. Is she just playing the race card now that she's caught? Maybe this is why she wasn't admitted to Cambridge. Jaslene tried to shield her parents from the worst of it, but her mother had always been sharper than she let on. "I see it all," she said one evening over the phone. "But you keep walking. You hear me? You walk like you belong in every room they try to push you out of." That voice steadied her. And then something shifted. A video surfaced on campus, shot by a third-year history student. Shaky, low resolution. But its message was unshakable. It showed a crowd of students marching across Oxford's South Lawn, holding signs, banners, and placards. "We are Jaslene, truth neo treason. Black brilliance is not a threat." Over 200 students joined. Some faculty stood at their windows, watching silently. Others looked away, but the noise grew. Chants echoed through the halls that had once swallowed Jaslene's voice. Outside the mathematics building, someone draped a massive banner from a balcony. Hawks must resign. The image went viral within hours. International outlets picked it up. Former students started sharing their own stories under the hashtag Oxford Unmasked. The protest didn't just challenge Hawks, it questioned the university's soul. Inside his office, Professor Reginald Hawks sat behind a polished oak desk, watching the footage on mute. He didn't blink, his jaw locked as he read the signs being held by students he once mentored. He turned to his assistant. "Do not respond," he said coldly. "Let it pass." But it wouldn't pass. Not this time. And Jaslene, she stood just beyond the crowd, hood up, watching her name ripple through streets that had once tried to erase it. She didn't cheer. She didn't chant. She just watched and felt something stir again. Not safety, not victory, but a surge of truth that was no longer hers alone to carry. That night, a leaked faculty memo reveals Professor Hawks has been granted a temporary research sabbatical, with full pay and no disciplinary action. The leaked memo hit the internet like cold water on a wound. Professor Reginald Hawks granted temporary research sabbatical. No accountability, no investigation, no apology, just absence wrapped in privilege. Jaslene read the words with a tight jaw. The university had chosen silence over justice. Again, but what it didn't realize was that the story had already outgrown the institution's control. That same night, an investigative piece dropped from The Metric, an independent outlet known for digging where legacy media feared to look. The headline was sharp. The pattern beneath the pedigree. How Oxford's star mathematician built his career on fear. It wasn't just about Jaslene anymore, it was about all of them. The piece chronicled a 2-decade history of psychological intimidation, targeted undermining, and administrative manipulation, all at the hands of Professor Reginald Hawks. But it wasn't written in accusation. It was written in receipts. The journalists had tracked down students from as far back as, some still in academia, some long gone. Each story echoed the same refrain. Hawks had a way of making you feel brilliant, until the moment you challenged him. Then he made you disappear. A Black Rhodes finalist recalled how Hawks praised his early thesis work, only to block it during review and label it premature. He left the program within a year. An Indian-born mathematician recounted how Hawks accused her of plagiarizing intuition. After she submitted a proof with parallels to a concept Hawks had only published privately. A neurodiverse student wrote that Hawks told him to lower his expectations after the student stuttered during the presentation. Dozens of stories, all dismissed at the time, all buried under academic bureaucracy, all suddenly resurfacing. The article exposed not just Hawks but the structure that protected him. Emails from senior deans revealed a recurring theme. Valuable asset, must manage optics carefully. That's what Hawks had been to them. A reputation shield, a mind too useful to discipline. And the damage he'd done? Collateral. The reaction across Oxford's alumni network was swift. Former students wrote open letters. Donors began suspending pledges. One foundation released a scathing statement. "We will not support an institution that shelters academic predators under the guise of excellence." For the first time, the university's pristine reputation cracked not under scandal, but under scrutiny. Inside the administration, panic rippled. Emergency meetings were held. PR advisors were called. But no one could agree on what to say. Because every narrative they'd rehearsed depended on Hawks being unimpeachable. And now, he was exposed. Jaslene watched it unfold from the sidelines, not as a bystander, but as the catalyst. And yet, the vindication brought no relief. She couldn't forget the threats to her family, the eviction, the silence from those who once called her promising. Still, something inside her shifted. She was no longer just fighting for her own name. She was standing for the names that were never spoken. 2 days later, another file leaked, this time anonymously. An internal HR document outlining a complaint Hawks had filed 5 years earlier. The target, a brilliant Afro-Caribbean student named Rochelle Mendez. The claim, hostile attitude, overconfidence, disrespectful challenge of instruction. The reason, she had corrected a miscalculation during a lecture. She was removed from her research group weeks later, her academic record suddenly under review. She left Oxford within the year. The university called it voluntary withdrawal. Now Rochelle's voice appeared in Jaslene's inbox. "I wish I had done what you did, but I'm proud someone finally did." The pattern was no longer deniable. Jaslene wasn't an exception. She was a blueprint. And the system? It had followed its programming. But one thing remained invisible, until now. A second leak, this time from within the university's IT department. A series of emails between Hawks and a faculty colleague, time-stamped 6 weeks before Jaslene arrived. Subject: incoming scholar profiles. One line sent a chill through the entire activist community watching her case. J. Carter, math track, U.S. equity slot, quota baggage, should be harmless. Jaslene stared at the words on screen, not for what they said, but for what they confirmed. He hadn't underestimated her after she proved him wrong. He had decided who she was before she ever set foot in that lecture hall. She was never a student in his eyes. She was inventory, a number to check off, a threat to contain. Her hands shook as she forwarded the email to Ava, her legal team, and a journalist at The Guardian. The message lit fire across social media. Quota baggage trended within hours, but not as mockery, as defiance. Black students posted photos of their diplomas, of their rejection letters, of their thesis titles, with one caption: "I am not your quota. I am not your baggage." Oxford scrambled again, but this time the storm wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from all sides. That evening, Hawks's lawyer issues a public statement, blaming Jaslene for hacking private faculty email, and announces a libel lawsuit against her for defamation. The day of the tribunal, the air in Oxford felt heavier, thicker with consequence. Beneath the stone arches of the Clarendon building, security was tighter than usual. Press credentials were verified at the gate. Faculty wore grim expressions. Protesters stood silently just outside, holding signs like shield. Jaslene speaks for all of us. This is not integrity. This is retaliation. Black truth matters. Inside the chamber, rows of long wooden benches faced a high dais where 7 tribunal members sat, an uncomfortable mix of faculty, legal counsel, and 2 student observers. The space smelled of old paper and polished wood, but nothing could mask the scent of institutional fear. Jaslene entered in a simple navy blouse, her hair pulled back, shoulders squared. She had spent the night memorizing everything, not her testimony but her control. Her tone, her breath, her calm. She knew this wasn't just about what she said. It was about how she appeared while saying it. Her attorneys flanked her. Ava sat quietly in the gallery. Every seat was full. The air buzzed with that kind of silence only broken by revelation. The university had tried to keep the proceedings closed, but public pressure had cracked that door open. Now the world was watching. Professor Hawks sat on the far end of the room, stoic, his lawyer whispering something into his ear. His expression hadn't changed since his sabbatical began, stone still, as if believing denial could be mistaken for dignity. The tribunal chair, a retired judge with thin spectacles and decades of academic bias in his posture, called the session to order.
"Ms. Carter," he began, "please begin your statement."
Jaslene stood. Her voice didn't shake. "I came to Oxford on a full scholarship to study mathematics. I didn't come for trouble. I came to learn. I was the only Black American in my department. I knew the burden of visibility. I knew the pressure to be perfect. But I never expected what I found." She paused, eyes scanning the faces in front of her. "Within 2 weeks I was targeted, publicly, not for failure but for succeeding, for solving a problem meant to humiliate me. The reaction wasn't correction, it was institutional backlash. They questioned my immigration status, tried to erase my enrollment. They leaked my family's address, and they called me." She held up a printed email. "Quota baggage, before I even arrived." Gasps rippled through the room. She set the paper down. "I'm not here because I'm angry. I'm here because the system broke over and over, and no one stopped it." The cross-examination came swiftly. A gray-haired faculty member leaned forward. "Ms. Carter, are you suggesting that Professor Hawks designed a curriculum around your personal failure?" "No," she replied calmly. "I'm stating that he designed a trap, and when I didn't fall into it, the university helped create a new one." Another tribunal member asked, "Were you not aware that accessing restricted files, even anonymously provided, could be seen as a breach?" Jaslene nodded. "I didn't access those files. They were sent to me by a whistleblower. But if exposing truth is a breach, then the real question is, what is the university so desperate to hide?" A hush. Even the student observers stopped writing. Then came the moment that changed everything. The tribunal chair cleared his throat. We have received a late request to admit a new witness. She flew in from abroad this morning. Miss Rochelle Mendez. Heads turned. Jaslene's eyes widened. Rochelle stepped into the room with the quiet poise of someone who had lived with the silence for too long. She wore a black suit and no makeup. She carried only one item, a folded letter. I was a doctoral student under Professor Hawks 5 years ago, she began. I corrected him during a seminar, a minor detail. 2 weeks later, my research group was reassigned. My funding was revoked. No warning, no explanation. I left Oxford before I could finish. She opened the letter. This is the complaint I filed in 2018, the one the university said they never received. She placed it on the tribunal desk. Stamped, signed, date marked. Ignored. Rochelle looked directly at the panel. I stayed silent because I thought I was alone. I thought maybe I was the problem. But then I saw Jaslene's story, and I realized it was the same playbook. Again. The room sat still, the tribunal members frozen behind their legal pads and institutional robes. For once no one spoke. Even Hawks didn't look up. Jaslene exhaled. Quietly. It wasn't relief. It was confirmation. She was never the beginning. She was the breaking point. The hearing continued for another hour. More questions, more attempts to redirect blame, more institutional gymnastics. But the damage was done. The emails. The pattern. The silence. The retaliation. Too much had already been made visible. As the tribunal chair prepared to adjourn for deliberation, one of the university's legal representatives requested to enter a final motion. The judge sighed. Proceed. The attorney stepped forward, face unreadable. We have uncovered new evidence regarding Professor Hawks' handling of confidential academic records. There is indication he may have falsified student evaluations and performance data in official systems to justify disciplinary actions, including those against Ms. Carter and others previously dismissed. Jaslene's heart stopped. The room erupted in murmurs. The tribunal chair raised his hand. This is a criminal matter. The university council nodded. We believe it now falls outside internal jurisdiction. We recommend pausing these proceedings and referring Professor Hawks to independent legal authorities for further investigation. For the first time since it began, Hawks's face broke. It wasn't fear. It was disbelief. He turned slowly toward his lawyer, who whispered with sudden urgency. For a man so used to controlling the room, the loss of that control hit like a gust of cold air through an open window. Jaslene sat silently, not triumphant, not angry, still, because now, the tables had turned. The tribunal recessed abruptly. No final judgment, no verdict yet. But one truth had pierced the marble walls.
This was no longer just a scandal. It was a case.
As Jaslene exits the tribunal chamber, she's surrounded by flashing cameras. One reporter shouts, "Did you know Hawks altered the academic records of 4 other black students, including one who never even made it into the program?" It didn't take long. Within 72 hours of the tribunal's suspension, Oxford released a brief public statement. Professor Reginald Hawks has been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending an external review. No apology, no admission, just distance. But the world didn't need a verdict to recognize what had happened. The digital paper trail had done what institutional silence could not: expose the anatomy of sabotage in real time. Screenshots of Hawksia's emails circulated like wildfire. Not just the ones about Jaslene, but about other students he'd dismissed as diversity indulgences, experimental admits, and statistical outliers. Jaslene had seen them all. One message sent to another faculty member. If we don't clip her now, she'll embarrass us on a larger stage. That one stuck in her mind like a scar. He wasn't just trying to challenge her. He was trying to erase her before the world had the chance to know her. The media storm intensified. News anchors who once floated accusations now delivered retractions. Think pieces flooded major publications. Students organized sit-ins. Alumni froze donations. Black scholars worldwide published an open letter. The systems we survive should not be celebrated until they're dismantled. Jaslene Carter did not just survive Oxford. She exposed it. For a moment, it looked like the university might shift under the pressure. Administrators began reaching out. Politely. Cautiously. She received a formal letter reinstating her student status. It was written with sterile precision, as if bureaucracy could undo humiliation. We welcome your return and reaffirm our commitment to providing a safe and inclusive academic environment. The words were empty. What they didn't say, that they'd ignored her. that they'd tried to deport her, that they only listened when the world forced them to. Jaslene didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked the city alone, through the same courtyards where whispers once followed her, through the same libraries that made her feel invisible. She passed new posters now, ones she hadn't printed. Oxford owes her more than reinstatement. The university tried to delete her. She rewrote the code. For the first time, Jaslene felt the weight shift, not lifted, but redistributed. She returned to her flat and sat in silence for a long time, staring at her whiteboard, now blank. Then she pulled out a notebook, not for coursework, but for strategy, because reinstatement wasn't justice, it was a reset, and she had no intention of walking back into Oxford quietly. The next morning, at a packed student forum live-streamed, translated, watched globally, Jaslene stepped to the podium. She wore no makeup, no robe, just clarity. She began not with numbers but with names. Names of students she'd never met, whose files she had seen. Names of those who left without a voice. Then she said the one sentence that shifted the room from applause to silence. I'm filing a civil suit against Oxford University for institutional racism, psychological harm, and attempted erasure. Gasps. Clicks of camera shutters. And then, and if we win, she added, her voice resolute, I'm donating every cent of that settlement to a scholarship fund for black girls who are told they're too loud, too smart, too visible. The room didn't erupt. It held its breath. Because this wasn't just retribution. This was a redesign. A challenge to the very blueprint of who got to learn, speak, and lead. Back at the university, officials scrambled. Legal teams met in back offices. Administrators debated containment strategies. Again. But it was too late. This wasn't a PR storm. It was a movement. One news anchor put it best. Oxford gave her a chalkboard. She turned it into a mirror. Across social media, thousands followed her legal campaign. The scholarship fund launched within days. Donations poured in from around the world. High-profile figures amplified it, but the pressure cut both ways. Jaslene began receiving new threats. More personal, more specific. You want to destroy this place? One email read. You better be ready to lose everything. Her legal team installed new security. Her parents relocated temporarily. She barely slept. The world that praised her still hadn't learned how to protect her. But Jaslene pressed on, because somewhere a black girl with a math notebook and a question too big for her school was watching. And she needed to see what happened next. Days later, Jaslene receives a confidential message from a retiring judge. Your case could open the door for criminal prosecution, not just against Hawks, but the university itself. Jaslene Carter had become a global name, but not for reasons any university brochure could contain. In the months following her legal announcement, the court case against Oxford gained momentum. But while lawyers drafted motions and analysts dissected institutional betrayal, Jaslene quietly redirected the spotlight away from herself and toward the girls still waiting to be seen. She declined interviews with morning shows that wanted a redemption arc, refused requests to appear on stage with diversity officers who'd once ghosted her calls. Instead, she met with organizers in Birmingham and Baltimore, Brixton and Brooklyn. She wasn't chasing justice through applause. She was building something. It started with one email. A high school math teacher from Cleveland messaged her. I have 6 girls asking me how they can be like you. What should I tell them? Jaslene stared at that message for a long time before answering. Tell them we're building something for them now. Within 3 weeks, she launched a pilot mentorship program, Genius in her name, focused on black girls aged 14-18. The initiative connected students with STEM professionals, scholars, and mental health mentors. Not just tutoring, but truth-telling. Real conversations about navigating systems designed to invisibilize them. The first Zoom session had 12 students. The second, 200. By the end of the quarter, over 1,000 girls were enrolled across 6 countries. One girl in North Carolina said, "It's the first time I've seen someone win without changing who she was." The program didn't just teach formulas. It taught resistance, boundaries, softness as strategy, anger as data, silence as signal. Every session began the same way. You are not a mistake in the system. You are the system's exposed flaw. Jaslene also partnered with grassroots legal orgs, launching workshops called Math and Power, where students learned how data, statistics, and analysis could dismantle policy discrimination and fuel community defense. In one workshop, she showed how redlining maps and school funding disparities could be reverse engineered through algorithms. You don't have to be loud to break a ceiling, she told the girls. But you do have to know where it was designed. Her story went viral again. Not for the scandal, but for the strategy. Universities that once ignored her sent her panel invitations. She declined most. But when historically black colleges reached out, she didn't just accept. She collaborated. By summer, Jaslene had spoken at Spelman, Howard, and Tuskegee. Her lectures weren't just about math. They were about power disguised as rigor. About proximity to whiteness being mistaken for excellence. About what it meant to thrive without permission. She said things most institutions weren't ready to hear, and that's exactly why she kept saying them. One article in The Atlantic called her the woman who turned Oxford's walls into windows. She didn't smile when she read it. She didn't want metaphor. She wanted transformation. Ova, still her closest collaborator, told her one night over dinner in London, "They still expect you to plateau, to burn out after the spotlight fades." Jaslene had just taken a bite of grilled plantain. She didn't even look up. "Then let's expand the spotlight," she replied. But even she didn't expect what came next. It began with a cryptic email from a Los Angeles production agency. The subject line was simply, "Jaslene, the motion picture." She almost deleted it, but curiosity won. Inside, a full proposal from a major studio. Netflix had optioned a deal based on her life. Directors were interested. A-list producers were attached. They had already storyboarded the lecture scene, the tribunal, the brick through her family's window. It felt surreal, distorted. She hadn't even finished her second year, but they wanted the climax already. Her attorneys reviewed the contract. The numbers were staggering. 7 figures. Creative control, global release, the power to shape the narrative. And for a moment, she considered it, not for the fame, not for the check, but because maybe, just maybe, seeing her story on screen would remind another girl in another classroom that she could say no, that she could raise her hand, that she could fight back and survive it. The studio gave her 48 hours to decide. She turned her phone off and walked the streets of East London, hood up, headphones in, passing women who looked like her, and girls who didn't yet know they were being watched. She passed a bookstore with a sign in the window that stopped her cold. Visibility is not protection. Visibility is exposure. Know the difference. She stood there for 10 minutes. Then she turned around and walked away from the deal. The next morning, Netflix sent a press release. "We regret to announce that Jaslene Carter has declined all biopic offers at this time. Her reason: my life is still being written, not performed." The internet didn't know what to make of it. Why would someone turn down that kind of money? That kind of platform? But Jaslene didn't care about performance. She cared about permanence. About legacy that couldn't be edited by a screenwriter. Days later, a student from Oxford secretly contacts her. A first-year black girl who was just assigned the same professor and the same equation. It would have been easy to sign the deal. Let her life become a screenplay. Let actors wear her story like a costume. Let the pain become a product. But Jaslene Carter had always known the difference between performance and purpose. And legacy? Legacy couldn't be sold. It had to be built. So instead of red carpets and interviews, she went home to Montgomery, Alabama. The place where she first learned what it meant to be underestimated. Where she memorized multiplication tables while her mother cooked dinner and her father installed wiring in the neighbor's attic to make rent. This was where she would build the next chapter. But it wouldn't be about her. It would be for those who were never offered a chapter at all. With a portion of the funds raised from global speaking engagements and donations from allies who believed in more than applause, she opened a building on land her grandfather once mowed as a janitor, land he was never allowed to enter through the front gate. She named it the Carter Institute for Ethical Education. But on the cornerstone outside, engraved in brass, were 4 names no history book would remember. For Anna, Darnell, Faye, and Miss Rutha, who taught brilliance without ever reading their own names in print. They were her great-grandmother, great-uncles, and a midwife who once taught Jaslene the beauty of long division, using corn kernels on a porch floor. The institute became a hub, not of elite academia, but of reimagined education. Here, brilliance wasn't measured by silence. Here, genius looked like joy, sounded like resistance, and moved like reclamation. The mission was simple: decolonize education. Not with slogans, but with strategy. They hosted fellowships for rural girls who'd never heard of Oxford but could break open complex algorithms in their sleep. They trained teachers on how to spot systemic bias in their own curricula. They developed software that rewrote traditional entrance exams, using culturally contextualized problem sets that challenged the white, Eurocentric framing of intelligence. And every fall, Jaslene taught a masterclass herself: systems as weaponry, how education becomes a gatekeeper. One student called it the first time I felt taught with instead of at. As the institute grew, so did its reach. Media outlets who once twisted her story now sent requests for interviews. Old classmates emailed her apologies, some sincere, others performative. Even a former Oxford chancellor visited Alabama. Requesting a tour, he smiled too much, spoke too softly, left behind a donation check that was quietly shredded before it cleared. Jaslene never forgot. She had learned that not all changed tones meant changed hearts. But she wasn't interested in revenge. She was interested in recalibration. One day, as she walked through the campus garden with Ava, now a co-director of the institute, they passed a mural being painted on the outer wall. A black girl with natural hair stood at a chalkboard, her hand midair, about to solve an equation. Jaslene stopped and stared. "She looks like you," Ava whispered. Jaslene shook her head. "No," she replied. "She looks like them, all the ones who never got to write the answer." Years passed. The institute became a model. Countries requested to replicate its structure. Curriculum licenses were requested from Ivy League schools. She approved some, declined others. A well-known textbook company offered a lucrative publishing deal. She countered with a demand: every textbook must feature at least 5 profiles of black mathematicians in its opening chapters. They laughed. She walked. A year later they returned, this time agreeing to her terms. She didn't flinch, because now she understood her power wasn't in proving her worth. It was in defining the terms. Occasionally, she still received messages from Oxford affiliates, some cloaked in goodwill, others in guilt. They wanted to partner, to heal the past, to explore future opportunities. Jaslene never responded. Forgiveness was never the goal. Redesign was. Then, on an otherwise quiet Thursday afternoon, her assistant handed her a handwritten letter with an Oxford postmark. She nearly tossed it, but something about the handwriting made her pause. Inside, a single sheet of lined paper, neat cursive, careful ink. "Dear Ms. Carter, my name is Aaliyah. I'm a first-year math student at Oxford. I'm the only black girl in my lecture hall. Last week, during our opening seminar, we were given a problem on the board. My professor, new to the faculty, called it a classic Hawks puzzle. I recognized the structure from a video of you. I remembered the pivot, the trick hidden in plain sight. So I solved it. Mid-sentence, just like you did. And the room fell silent. Not because I was wrong, but because they realized I knew where the trap was. You taught me that brilliance isn't the answer, it's the resistance. Thank you for making space. For not signing that movie deal. For building something real. Sincerely, Aliyah Mensa. Oxford University. Class. Jaslene read it 3 times. Then placed it in a frame. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. That legacy was never loud. It was quiet, repetitive, passed down in letters, problems solved mid-sentence, and girls who refused to wait for permission. Jaslene receives an urgent call from her legal team. The Oxford case has reached the High Court, and a ruling is imminent. What it says could change education law forever. Jaslene never walked Oxford's stone paths again. She never sat beneath its centuries-old lecture halls, never breathed in the chill of the library, where she once solved a trap designed to humiliate her. Never returned, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. Oxford changed. But not because it wanted to, because it had to. Because a girl from Alabama cracked an equation too complex for the institution to calculate. A formula that fused intelligence with resistance, brilliance with refusal. Because Jaslene Carter had forced the math to matter. In the year following the High Court's ruling, the institution issued its most sweeping reforms in over a century. Mandatory anti-bias training for all faculty. A review board of external educators to oversee disciplinary processes. Full transparency on tenure-track hiring. Required reporting on race, gender, and class demographics. For the first time, Oxford created a scholarship exclusively for black women in STEM. They called it the Carter Fellowship. She hadn't asked for it. She never applied to endorse it. But she didn't need her signature on the plaque. Her impact was already coded into every lecture rewritten, every policy reversed, every future student who no longer had to perform excellence while fighting invisibility. Professor Reginald Hawkes, meanwhile, disappeared into obscurity. After the tribunal fallout, the data manipulation case progressed. More students came forward. More files were uncovered. He was stripped of his professorship, barred from teaching, and quietly removed from academic boards. No farewell ceremony. No archived lectures. His Wikipedia entry shrank from leading voice in mathematical education to 2 lines. Dismissed following ethics violations. No current academic affiliation. Legacy isn't what you build when you're seen. It's what survives when you're not. And Hawks, he didn't survive history. He became its caution. Years later, students in Oxford classrooms referenced the Carter equation, a real mathematical concept derived from Jaslene's early work on behavioral statistics and equity-based algorithms. They didn't say her name in reverence. They said it in rhythm, like Newton, like Euler, like Carter. Her theorems were cited in journals. Her lectures were analyzed in textbooks. Her resistance was printed in syllabi. One student wrote on her final exam, "I solved the problem, but I solved it knowing why the problem existed." And that, Jaslene would have said, was the real proof. In Alabama, the Carter Institute expanded. Now spanning 3 buildings and 4 continents through virtual classrooms, the institute partnered with public schools, prisons, and tech companies to build ethical pipelines into education and data science. Jaslene still taught, though less frequently. She preferred small, unfilmed gatherings. No microphones. Just a chalkboard and 12 chairs. Because while the world wanted to scale her story, she wanted to keep its roots intact. She never trademarked her name. Never branded her pain. She didn't sell memoirs. Didn't chase speaking fees. She chose privacy when possible, impact when necessary. Because some equations aren't meant to be solved for applause. They're meant to be passed on. On a crisp autumn morning, Jaslene sat with Ava, outside a local cafe, their teas cooling beside thick folders of new mentorship applications. A small group of teenagers walked by, laughing, loud, free. One girl turned around, stopped, then whispered to her friend, "That's her." Jaslene looked up. The girl didn't ask for a photo. She just nodded. A quiet acknowledgement between one who walked through fire and one now walking through a door she helped open. Ava smiled. "They don't see you as a victim." "I never was," Jaslene said. "And they don't see you as angry." "I am," she said, without shame. "But mostly," Ava added, "they see you as proof." That evening, Jaslene sat down for what would become her final televised interview. It was the 10-year anniversary of the tribunal. The interviewer, polished and nervous, asked all the right questions. Then he leaned forward. "If Professor Hawks were watching this right now, what would you say to him?" Jaslene didn't blink, didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, then smiled. "He taught me everything I needed," she said, "about what I never want to become. No one should have to outsmart a system just to be treated like they belong." Jaslane's story isn't rare, it's just one that couldn't be buried. If you've ever felt silenced, overlooked, or erased, you're not alone. Type yes if you believe silence should never win. Subscribe if this broke your heart and opened your eyes.